Life is always full of surprises. Today I'll tell you a story that happened in Eastern Europe some years ago, in faraway Romania. It was July 2006. The summer vacations had arrived. Eleonora Martin Dare had promised her grandchildren that if they got good grades, she'd take them to the place where they'd always dreamed of going. In fact, it had been a long time since they left home. You see, life wasn't easy for the lady. Since living with her grandchildren, she did everything she could to provide for them and give them the best. Sometimes she even had to work in the fields to make ends meet and save up. It turns out that fate for her and her grandchildren was really cruel because 4 years ago, the woman buried her daughter and son-in-law, who unfortunately had an incident while they were sleeping. It turns out that the man and woman went to a cabin where they'd celebrate their anniversary of marriage, and the place was perfect for a couple. Everything was fine. The dinner the wife made was delicious. However, apparently they had a few too many drinks and fell asleep without realizing that a fire had spread. According to investigators, the culprits were lit candles. Both died of asphyxiation, which of course was terrible news that shocked the towel. The daughter and her husband couldn't escape and consequently lost their lives. Since then, the grandmother was forced to take care of her grandchildren, as there was no one else to take care of them at the time. Anna, the oldest, was 6 years old, and Sebastian, the youngest, was only 3 years old. That was how time went by. Finally, the woman finished packing the suitcases and they hurried to the train station. After many hours of traveling, they arrived at the place. Now the children were very happy on the seashore. Every day they splashed and sunbathed. The 2 weeks of vacation passed very quickly, so that in 2 days they'd have to return to their village in the east of the country, where they only had a small house. Unfortunately, there was no money left on the parent side, only a car that the grandmother had to sell to pay for the damage done to the cottage. And even then it didn't finish that debt. They didn't leave a house either, since the one they had was rented, even though shortly before his death the son-in-law inherited a large amount of money from his father. But for some reason the man's bank accounts were empty. To find out what happened, Eleonora had to wait for her grandchildren to come of age so they could investigate it on their own, or pay a lawyer. But money was tight, so she had to raise the little ones on her limited pension. As it was to be the last day of vacation, Graham and the children went to visit one of the busiest beaches in the area that they had not yet visited. As usual, the grandchildren were having fun by the water, and Eleonora watched them lovingly. Sebastian and his sister had just finished building a sandcastle when suddenly, looking to the side, the girl was stunned, eyes wide open. She ran to her grandmother. "Grandma, Grandma, look, it's Mom and Dad," she said, pointing to a young couple with her hand. Amazed, the old woman looked where the granddaughter was pointing and almost fainted. She couldn't believe it. She immediately recognized her daughter, but her son-in-law looked a little different. Surprised, she didn't know what to do. She even cried with emotion. So she told her grandchildren that she'd come soon. In fact, she'd met some women earlier who also had their children, and she asked them as a favor to take care of her grandchildren while she went out for a while. "Children, I'll be back in a bit. Anna, take care of your brother," the woman told her. That's how she went after the couple, because she didn't know if they had only a physical resemblance or if something supernatural was going on. She knew it was inappropriate to go any closer without being completely sure that it was really them. In the meantime, the couple arrived at a large house next to the beach and then disappeared inside. Without hesitation, the woman called the police, then returned for her grandchildren, and they sat down to wait. 4 years before these events, a couple was enjoying a moment together in a cabin in the woods. It was Sylvia and Daniel. But there was someone else. It was Alex, the man's twin brother. The man had been released from prison where he'd spent several years of his life. Alex was rebellious. Since he was younger, he got involved with bad people and ended up behind bars, finally taking his mother to the grave of so many worries. Thus, the father, who was a businessman, left all of his money to the other son. Daniel was the complete opposite of his brother. It was even hard to believe that the two were related. Unlike Alex, Daniel had absolutely no bad habits. He graduated from school and college with honors, getting a job in a village as head of several farm fields. There he met his future wife, Sylvia, who works picking vegetables. Of course, for the woman, Daniel was not the kind of man she was looking for, but he was an excellent match for the future because he had great potential and would certainly achieve great success in life. In addition, at his young age, he was already managing several farms. On the other hand, at Sylvia's home, it was not a good relationship with her mother. Although she tried to guide her on the right path with wise advice and education, the young girl ignored her and only wished madly for an independent life away from her progenitor. She was truly rebellious. Daniel looked at her, and her beauty really captivated him. She was slender and beautiful. He was a very serious young man, but attended to her. He'd start talking to her and invite her to lunch. She would accept. He even brought her flowers every day, wrote her poetry, and made endless gifts to please her. He was really a thoughtful gentleman. One day, she gave up, of course, not because she fell in love with him, but because she discovered that the boy had a very large apartment where she could finally hide from her mother's morals. A few months later, the young people were married. Miss Eleonora was incredibly happy, believing that her daughter had finally come to her senses and became more responsible. Since she really liked her son-in-law, he was a very educated man, now it seemed that life would go on just as she had dreamed it would. Of course, Sylvia began to have a life like never before. She bought dresses, met with refined people. They rented a big house, got a new car, and she behaved very well with her husband. In fact, she gave him 2 wonderful children. She was a responsible and decent wife. Until Daniel's brother appeared. His life was not so good in prison, and while he was looking for a job, he saw the news that his father had died, leaving some business and his savings. So he decided to return to make his profit. But he soon found out that the only heir was his brother, and he was living somewhere else. So he went to face him. When he opened the door, Sylvia was simply stunned. Standing in the doorway was the spitting image of her husband, only much fitter. I like this kind of guy better than a nerd like Daniel. Without asking Alex permission, he entered the house and, leaning back in a chair, began to speak. "Hello, dear, you must be my brother's wife. I think you're a little surprised by our resemblance. Did he never tell you about me? Well, fear not. We're only twins." Of course, Alex was a real daredevil, and the woman definitely liked that. That behavior fascinated her, and she didn't realize how, but after talking for a few moments, she found herself in the man's arms, and she even forgot that her husband would be coming any minute. She gave him the food she'd prepared for her husband. However, in a moment of decency, or perhaps out of fear of being found, the woman realized she was not doing the right thing. So she decided to throw her brother-in-law out of the house. After all that had happened, Alex changed his mind about seeing his brother. Now his interest was focused on the woman. She was a very curvaceous young woman. She didn't seem to have 2 children, he thought. One day he went to his brother's house again. "You know, I don't think, Sylvia, that you could get into my head so quickly. I saw your wonderful eyes and your lips. I realized that you are the girl of my dreams. And yet such a treasure belongs to my fool of a brother. Is that fair? Of course it isn't. But what are you suggesting? That I should divorce Daniel? No way. I'll be completely penniless. His father left him enough money. He has them in the bank, and he wants to buy a house in the capital, or rather a mansion for us. I'll finally leave this filthy town," answered the woman while pouring herself a glass of wine. Hearing her words, a nasty look appeared in Alex's eyes. He came up with a perverse plan. You see, he was not in love with Sylvia, but the obsession he had for her and the thirst for revenge for his brother, whom he blamed for his unfortunate wife, whom he took away the affection of his parents, made him offer the woman a terrible idea, and she accepted without even thinking about her children. One afternoon, Sylvia asked her husband to go to a cabin where she'd rented near a lake in the forest to celebrate their wedding anniversary. They went there, leaving the children with the grandmother. Daniel was rarely happy because for a long time he and his wife had not been together in nature, but if only the poor man knew that these were the last moments of his life, he would not be so happy. Little did he know that Sylvia had ground up several sleeping pills and mixed them into his wine glass. Daniel drank them and passed out. She immediately called Alex, who arrived in a rented car, and together with a woman grabbed him by the arms and plunged him into the lake so that he would suffocate. Just for a moment, the wife felt a little pity because she was taking not only the life of her husband, with whom she'd lived a little more than 7 years, but also the father of her children. But the cheerful words of her lover consoled a woman. "Now we're free, you and I." Shortly after, the man took the body of a woman out of the trunk of the car. She had great resemblance to Sylvia. In fact, that victim was a street drunk who had a relationship with Alex in the city, and he sent her money to travel into town with the story that he missed her.